Well, good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name's John O'Riordan, and I'm with Creatively United and the Gail O'Riordan Climate and Arts Legacy Project. I want to welcome you from Victoria, British Columbia. We're on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish speaking people, and we're honored to share the territory with them. So this afternoon and this evening, we're going to be talking about transformations, global reset, and reconciliation. I just want to give you a few words about the Creatively United and Climate and the Arts. So this is a partnership that Francis and I developed about 6 months ago. And it started in honor of my wife's name, Gail O'Riordan, who passed from cancer a couple of years ago. And she was a very strong advocate for climate activism and a better world, and also a professional musician. So she had the idea of linking climate and the arts together so that we could share climate stories and use the arts as a way of inspiring us to do better in terms of meeting the climate crisis requirements. So we, over the last 6 months, first 2 months actually, have put together 15 videos because we weren't able to have any public concerts. So the videos are ways of explaining the climate stories, and we've had some musical interludes included in the videos. All the videos are on Creatively United website. 7 were in Earth Week, and 8 have been under the Climate and Artist series. So the principles that Climate and the Arts are following are very much tied to this afternoon's, this evening's presentation, which is on how can we live better with nature, live within nature's limits. Secondly, how can we orient our self-interest to that of the planet so that when we make decisions, we don't make them decisions on our personal behalf, but we make them to be knowledgeable about how they will contribute to a sustainable planet. The third thing is we want to tap into each of our spiritual awareness and to be more cognizant of who we are within the broader universe. And I think once we do that, we'll feel more connected and more engaged. And I think more reconciled in the context of what Michael and Merrel will be talking to us later on. But finally, we want to encourage an economic base that is based on kindness, on compassion, and on caring, and not on personal gain or profit. So it's a different kind of economy. And it's that transition that we want to talk about today. So I'm going to argue that the pending crisis that we're facing is like a disease, but like any disease, it's in fact a gift because it's going to force humanity to come to terms with its future in a way that no other kind of disease I don't think can do. In other words, we need the kind of challenge that takes place as we have moved outside climate's boundaries, Earth's boundaries, to force us back into a more kinder and a more sustainable lifestyle. And we're going to explore with Bob and Merrel and Michael in a few minutes how we make that transition from where we are now to where we want to get to over the next 10 or 20 years. So I've got 3 wonderful colleagues who are sharing this video with me, and I'm going to get them to introduce themselves briefly and what they see as their role and commitment to this transformational moment. The first one I want to talk to or introduce is my friend Bob Sandford from Canmore, Alberta. Bob?
Thank you very much, John. As John said, my name is Bob Sandford. I hold the Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health. And in this capacity, I was co-author of the UN Water in the World We Want report on post-2015 global sustainable development goals relating to water. And I was also the lead author of Canada in the Global World, a new United Nations expert report examining the capacity of Canada's water capacity in governments in general to meet and help others meet the UN's 2030 Transforming Our World Water-Related Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see that I've been involved in transformation and reconciliation for some time. And I am also the author, co-author, or editor of more than 30 books, including 2 that I co-authored with our host, Dr. John O'Riordan, and one other co-authored with Merrel and Phare, who is also on this webinar. And my latest books, Rain Coming Down and The Anthropocene Disruption, were published in 2019. And both of those books are about societal transformation, something we've been working on long before the pandemic, but we see now has been brought forward as a crucial understanding of how we move forward in transformation in the world and in our society right now.
Thank you very much, Bob. Well, Merrel, you're in Winnipeg, I believe. So can you bring us up to date with your role and your interests?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm online here from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm a lawyer by training, and I've been in private practice for almost 30 years, but simultaneously, I have worked in and was co-founder of, with 10 First Nation chiefs 25 years ago, a national Indigenous charitable environmental organization called the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources, which we didn't really frame it that way at the time, but I look back now and realize it was a reconciliation organization almost from the beginning, because the chiefs that envisioned this national organization envisioned it because environmental issues cross borders. They don't reside in one place. They affect us all. They envisioned the organization as a partnership of various forms of knowledge and various people. So we have, like, I worked there for 25 years, still do, and I'm non-Indigenous. And we have other people who are non-Indigenous there. And so I've spent a lot of time working with Indigenous people my whole life, working on environmental projects in Indigenous communities with Indigenous governments. And so I'm also a co-host of a podcast called Porcupine Podcast with Michael, who you'll meet in a moment, on reconciliation. And I'll talk more about that later. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Merrel. Just a quick question though, on the 25 years that you've been engaged in this, have you seen change for the better? Are you more hopeful now than you were at the beginning of your engagement with the center?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting because the problems they seem more complex now, but also the tools we have available to deal with them are better than we did before. Speaking from a legal perspective, even just a legal perspective, yeah, I have seen progress, and I've also see things gotten a little bit more difficult too. So.
Well, we're going to explore that in a few minutes. I just wanted to start off. Now, Michael, you've got an illustrious background because I think you were at one time a minister of the Crown. And so maybe you can give us a bit more about your background and where you're at these days.
All right. Good day, folks. Pleasure to be here. I'm a little different in my background. I basically grew up in reconciliation from the time I was basically a baby, living on reserves in Northern Ontario and Quebec, but most of my life in the Northwest Territories since 1962. And I've spent years, nine years of my schooling was in residential and public school or day schools. And I've grown up and lived in the North. I got elected into the legislature up here. It's a consensus government approach where there's no parties. You have to work together. A whole different approach where the population is 50% Indigenous. And I had the benefit of being a minister for 14 years. And now I work for myself and with Merrel and Bob and illustrious people like yourself, John, after my political career to try to see how we continue to add value to the very difficult and trying but necessary processes we're in, including reconciliation.
Did you find your time in politics rewarding, and are you finding your time outside politics more rewarding, or is that What are they just different ways in which you've engaged in this area of interest?
Well, politics is unique, and it's the one place where a person can get to be involved in actually writing and passing laws. Outside of politics, you have to use different skills. I've discovered working with Merrel and Bob to influence how government works and how change happens. So the political life was very rewarding, but the work I'm in now is in its own way equally rewarding.
Wonderful. Well, you have a wonderful long-term partnership, and I'm very, very impressed with what you've done collectively, and I'm looking forward to exploring that in the next 2 hours. So I'm going to start our conversation with Bob, because Bob and I have been working on a concept of using the pandemic as a transformational moment that none of us on this screen want to go back to where we were before the pandemic hit. We find, at least I find it's a gift in giving us an opportunity to reset the way we want to act as a community and more broadly on the earth. And we've shown that we can collectively work together in the pandemic, not some nations better than others, but overall, I think there's been a tremendous shift towards community and communal action, and that bodes well for the kind of crisis that we have to do. So the pandemic is a fast forward to the real crisis, which is going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. So Bob, maybe you can outline at the beginning of your presentation, what are the risks that we're facing at the moment? What do you think are the big things that we're going to have to deal with?
I think the most immediate risk at the moment is that our society will lapse into some different but still functionally unaltered vision of what we had before the pandemic, which would be a disaster leading only to the next disasters. The world won't be and shouldn't be the same again after this pandemic. And our interest should reside in not recreating the world that we had, but rather in creating the world we want and the world we need to have if we are to perpetuate tolerable living conditions for ourselves and for the rest of life on this planet in the future. And I have to say that more and more people are feeling this way, and I remain hopeful, truly so. I think COVID-19 has stopped society in its tracks, and the pandemic is what I often say I hope history will remember as the great pause. We are literally grounded until we get grounded. And while it would be critical to ensure we're better protected from future pandemics, we can't stop there. We must use this extraordinary hiatus to thoughtfully consider how we can perpetuate our gains in carbon emissions reductions, for example, while at the same time making other critically needed changes to our economies and our lifestyle expectations that will make us not just less vulnerable to pandemics in the future, but will bolster meaningful, persistent action in achieving the goals of the UN's 2030 Transforming Our World Global Sustainable Development Agenda. But I have to say that there's real urgency here. We have before us a real moment in which we can turn this great pause into an opportunity for global reset and the emergence of new hope. But to make that transformation, we have to act on behalf of that hope. And my belief is that the first thing we need to realize is that if we are to address the climate threat in time, we need reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation, first with one another and at the same time with the earth. And we know now that Indigenous people, what Indigenous people have known for thousands of years, we can reduce and moderate the threat of climate disruption by protecting, restoring, and constantly rehabilitating natural system function. So from this, we see that this is not the end of the world, it's just the beginning of another. And because we're so connected, people today, as the pandemic has demonstrated, and we've expanded our capacity to think in terms of community rather than just thinking about ourselves, I see great power and opportunity in realizing this. For it's at the local level where we live that we have the most power to affect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. So I see this as a true transformational moment.
So Bob, I've been working with friends Sandy and company on in Drawdown, and I think they have a sort of a hierarchy around which we engage. So the lowest level or the most immediate level of the hierarchy is you engage with the individuals. You talk to individuals and you get individuals to talk to others so that we start to share some of our ideas. And then you move up and talk to communities, yeah, either community organizations or more formally communities. And then you move up to talking to institutional areas like schools and universities where people are banding ideas and sharing ideas and hopefully promoting new ideas. And finally, when you've got an alignment between the individual, the community, and the institutions, you're in a position to talk to the politicians because you have a creative mass behind you who will make change happen. I hope I've got that roughly right, Sandy, in my presentation. Do you want to speak to that? Because if I've made a mess of that, let me know. Okay. So have you got any comments about how we bend the carbon curve and at what level we can start to engage? How you're engaging and what you see what needs to be engaged to actually make a change to this continuous increasing Keeling curve?
Well, you've said it before, the Keeling curve is the next COVID curve that we have to address. We have to flatten these curves. And I think it's really important when we look at what we're doing right now is that we are trying to bring people together to see, first of all, that they can deal with this pandemic. But in this moment now is a really good time for them to think about what we want the world to look like when we get through it. And we've created a program called Global Reset in the Future of Hope with the idea that we can allow people the time to think through what they want in their own words or in images or in music or in sculpture, however they may wish to express these ideas, what they would like that future to be like. And the initial premise of this project is that, well, it will be critical to rebuild our society structure when the pandemic passes. We've got to use this hiatus to figure out the best and most effective ways we can build up from the community, as you say, but also to have our governments and also multilateral organizations help raise the ceiling so that communities can actually build upward from this new view of how we have to act in a changed world. And the goal is, again, not just to make us less vulnerable to pandemics or to strengthen communities, which are really, really important, but to set the world on a course so that we can achieve the blueprint, which is the Transforming Our World Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, and they're all linked so that we can ensure that we never come this close to crossing the threshold of societal collapse again. And a very valid point has been made that there will be many transformational moments spread over time in a broad range of sectors in our society. And we need to attend to that. We need to identify and track as many of these as we can. And it's quickly become clear to do that, we need to assemble diverse groups of thoughtful people with the goal of identifying when an optimal range of diverse transformational moments might align, and then to determine how best to act on those moments, first of all, locally, nationally, and globally when that alignment occurs. And I think we've started to do that. We've collected an astonishing array of extraordinarily competent people who have taken up this invitation, and many have done this independently on their own. In the areas in which those who have chosen to accept our invitation to participate.
Bob, can I just stop it for a minute? Because I just want to make sure we have a bit more conversation with Merrel, and then I'll come back to who you got in your lineup.
Yeah, okay, certainly.
So Merrel, Bob's talking about this great pause. Are you seeing that with your Indigenous communities? Or are they able to relate to this, the way the pandemic may restructure the way they operate, or are they not really in a position to take advantage of the pause? What's your experience?
Well, and Michael and I both work with the Dene Nation in the Northwest Territories right now, and I, through SEER, am working on a whole number of projects with Indigenous communities across Canada. And I think that this moment has huge opportunity for them, but because they are some of the most vulnerable communities in Canada, being very sort of threatened by and at risk and poverty, low employment rates, higher suicide rates. You know, you have a whole bunch of wellness indicators that are the lowest in Canada with Indigenous people. The threat of COVID is so severely potentially impacting that right now, most of the communities I know are on lockdown. Like they are just not letting anybody in because they don't have doctors who live there. They don't have hospitals nearby. They have very low resilience in terms of health indicators in some situations. And so they recognize that there's, I think, an opportunity for a conversation to come out of this, particularly with economic stimulus spending, and thinking about how to reboot the economy. But they're not right there yet. They're just coping with the chaos and the potential crisis and trying to avert it.
Well, if I could speak to that just for a moment, one of the things that certainly we're concerned about is exactly that. And first of all, I think it's really important to point out that epidemics in the past have nearly destroyed Native cultures. So they are undoubtedly far more sensitive to that than anyone else, and they would certainly know that. And this is one of the things that I think is really important about this transformational moment. We can't let things fall off the table. And reconciliation is one of them, as I will conclude, because I think without reconciliation with Indigenous people in this country, we can't have a transformational moment.
I'd agree with that. We're going to explore that in a few minutes. But Michael, it seems to me that one of the features of this pandemic is that it's demonstrated and emphasized the disparity between the people who are more vulnerable, who are poorer, who are not as well set up in society, as against those who are in the top 1%. And what's your experience? Is this a portent that we need to address this inequity as a result of the pandemic in order for us to be able to address the kind of inequity that's going to be caused by a changing climate? And the same people who are vulnerable to COVID are going to become very vulnerable to a changing climate. Do you not think this is a time that we have to start to think about inequity in more substantive ways?
I agree, but we just have to look to our past to see the very, very parallels where we are now. I'm just reading a book called Alaric the Goth, tied into the fall of the Roman Empire at a time of pestilence and unrest and disparity. And we all know what happened to the Roman Empire, so we can learn from that. I'm also reading a series about the future, and the human condition is repeating itself again and again. We are in a time when can we affect that change, and can we address the issue of reconciliation and the balance and the unequal distribution of wealth? If we don't, then they're going to be having a discussion at some point in the future, comparing us once again to other failed civilizations in the past.
So I agree with you. And I think this is one of the key features of how reconciliation will become a core element as we move forward, because it will force us to deal with this inequity and start to build bridges. But before we go back to reconciliation, Bob, you and I have been working on this global reset. You've got a number of people who are interested in participating in your project, some of whom will be invited, as you know, to speak to the Creatively United webinar series this fall, because we're going to be doing a series 2 this fall starting in September. And some of the very people that you're engaged with on transforming the way we think. So can you give us a thumbnail sketch of 2 or 3 or 4 of the people that you feel are going to be exciting contributors to our fall series?
Well, I think, first of all, our 2 other guests are going to offer an expanded version of the discussion on reconciliation as part of that. But
I'm talking about English people, not just...
Merrel, Phare, and Michael Miltenburger are going to do that. But you know, what's interesting about this is that we're trying to go beyond the notional in this to actual working our way down to figure out exactly what needs to be done in terms of policy and when. So we're looking at a broad range of topics in transformation, energy, economy, and finance. We have someone who will give a webinar on that. Technological innovation, certainly poverty alleviation, but really quite interesting, a great deal of interest in ethics and morality. And we expect to have discussions about that in the fall also. But musicians also who happen to have really deep philosophical and practical experience, some of them as politicians, will share that. And the discussions are going to be, I think, really directed by the fall, because we'll be more clear about where we stand at that time and what this means. But it will also mean that we're going to be looking at embracing nature's rights and environmental ethics in a post-pandemic reality, faith and religion, as well as reconciliation, as I've already indicated. And, we've invited singers, songwriters, poets, painters, and artists, too, to join us. And our goal is not dissimilar to yours that you've indicated with the Gail O'Riordan Climate and the Arts Legacy series. We're interested in living in harmony with nature and oneself. We want to align self-interest with planetary interests. We want to awake global spirituality by connecting the universal with the individual. And we want to work toward creating a more just, caring, and compassionate society. And I think some of the things that are happening now, that people are willing to risk the threat of the pandemic to speak on behalf of Black Lives Matter and equality that goes beyond that to address issues of inequality socially and economically widely in the world. These show that there's a real appetite right now for transformation.
So, Merrel, when I was involved in government, I did a lot of work with Indigenous people, mainly on the coast, out of the Great Bear Rainforest, but on a number of other initiatives, because we were heavily involved in trying to establish treaties or some form of engagement between government and Indigenous people, because there was no mechanism other than a treaty process that got kind of bogged down. But one of the things I was most impressed with, because I'm a musician, was how the Indigenous people can weave stories with music and create a different form of storytelling. Did you come across that experience at all with your work with Indigenous people, the importance of fusing art and storytelling?
Absolutely, and not even just music, dance, beadwork, painting. Almost every Indigenous art form that I've been exposed to is actually about story. It's about storytelling. It's about conveying the culture and the rules for living and the relationship with land and water and the relationship with the Creator. It's all in that. And there isn't. I don't think they separate them. We might separate them into storytelling and art and somewhat different a bit, but I don't. My experience is that that's the mechanism for storytelling in many ways, is through art. And so it's and some of the most and very, very similar to like Western art, the meaning of the art is not always obvious in the beginning, right? Like I have spent my whole life listening to elders, talking to chiefs, talking to community members, and I've spent my life processing the things I've been told and trying to understand what is being said. And that is exactly the purpose of art, to shine a light, to teach you something, but not feed it to you. Like you've got to process it for yourself and think about it and figure out where you are in relation to that. And so it's, I would absolutely agree. Definitely.
Well, it's one of the things we're trying to do, because we've Creatively United and Climate and the Arts have teamed up with Ballet Victoria, which is the main ballet company here in Victoria. And we've created a beautiful video of ballet dancers in the trees. It's a story of a young dancer, a 12 or 13-year-old girl and a dog. And she's like Alice in Wonderland. She comes into the forest and she's overwhelmed by the beauty of the forest. And the dancers portray nature and movement in and around trees. And then she comes across a tree that is cut and has been logged, and it destroys her concept of nature, and she is grief-stricken. and she has one of the dancers is helping her through the grief. And then she comes out of that and realizes that there is a hopeful future. We just have to get behind thinking about using forests for commercial purposes and using for what they are, a full panoply of nature. And when we do that, we can still have an economy with the trees, but we can maintain their natural contribution. So that's one of the stories we're looking at, and I'll talk about another story later on. Bob, do you want to talk about how you see science changing and what hope you have for a new form of science? I know that you've been involved with the science community for some time, and there's been quite a bit of question marks about how solid science is on climate. How do you see science moving to provide a platform in your transformational moment over the next?
Well, I think that first of all, there has been a great deal of confusion about the legitimacy of science, and it's been fomented by people who are really trying to disrupt the effectiveness of science on evidence-based decision-making and policy-making. And it's set us back a very, very long time. And it's also put us in a position now that we have a pandemic where we have two global crises simultaneously. But I'm optimistic in a sense, especially if you live in Canada. We here in Canada have an ace in hand that other countries lost that exposes them to the full brunt of climate change and other disruptions. We still have relatively intact natural systems. And we know that natural systems slow and moderate global change. And we have the science to prove it. I mean, researchers right here in Canada have shown that intact systems have already absorbed 4 degrees of warming without significant changes in hydrological regimes in places like these mountains in which I live. And we know this globally too. And to that end, the UN is calling for a restoration imperative. But it's exactly what we're talking about here. It demands that we first restore local identity, like how we relate to the communities in which we live, and also our sense of place, that we deepen and broaden our connections to where we live. And it demands that we restore truth, and it restore responsibility to human dignity, to economic morality and equality, and in so doing, restore common purpose so that we can have a vision for the future of humanity and the planet. But most importantly, such an imperative must become an immediately effective vehicle for the protection and rapid restoration of natural systems. And at the moment, it's really interesting to note in this country, what we've saved in terms of natural process is now saving us. And it's therefore very critical to protect and restore what we have for the sake of the integrity and resilience of the larger Earth system and our capacity to have the room to move to make this transformational moment real and productive.
So, Michael, you've been in politics, obviously. To what extent did you see science informing politicians and political decisions, and to what extent were other factors beyond science dominant in your policy making when you were working in the Northwest Territories?
When I was Minister of the Environment, I spoke at many times at functions where there were many scientists, and the big issue that I would talk about was doing the science is not enough, that there has to be a link with science to the politicians and to the policy, to inform policy. And if scientists would think that their science and their findings should stand on their own merit, was an incorrect assumption, that their responsibility was not only to do the science, but they also had to recognize for it to have value, it had to connect into the political systems. And if we look through our history, science on its own is one thing. When you mix science with politics, science with business, science with religion, that's where the trouble starts. And sorting out what is relevant and true is difficult. And politicians, as you well know, John, as a former deputy, need to have clear connections made for them many times, and things reduced to basically plain English that can be understood not only at the cabinet table, but at the kitchen table. And scientists sometimes forget that fact.
That's true. It's I was teaching a course at UBC for 10 years, and one of the teachable moments was how to get students to pseudo address cabinet, to think through how they would address cabinet, at what level would they pitch their presentations, because you have to get the right themes in the right language and grab their attention. There's an art to this, and it needs to be taught, and once you've learnt it, it becomes a much more easy way to communicate.
I speak to that, John, when you have a moment.
Absolutely. Go for it.
No, I think that this is a really important point that Michael Miltenburger and you have both made. Foundation of my work at the UN is science, and it seems to me that the commandments of science, and I say this often, can be reduced to two: to tell the truth and to stand up for humanity and for the planet now and the future. And artists do that, and they do that as a matter of course. And we need all of us together, and especially brilliant artists, to help us get to what Michael's talking about, not just at the cabinet level to understand it, but at the kitchen table. And I look at like well-developed climate models. Artists allow us to imagine future worlds based on the one in which we live now. And in so doing, they allow us to imagine the world not just as it might be, but to imagine the world we want. And I think that what really makes them so credible is that artists make actual, rather than just ritual, sacrifices in order to establish and maintain their authenticity. And I think it's fair to say that climate community is very matter of fact, as Michael has pointed out, and sometimes too technical in how they communicate that science. And we don't really, we explain in the technical terms in which we work what we think we can expect, but we don't consider ourselves qualified to project what those changes will mean to people's identity and their sense of self. And the literary and visual arts offer a different way of understanding what science is telling us, as do indigenous arts and music and dance. Writers and artists tell the climate story through story and can project the impacts it could have on a specific people and families in specific places that science would be very loath to project. So writers, artists help us imagine what climate change could actually mean, where you live, and how it could shape your life and the lives of the people that you care about. And I think they reach into, that's why they're so trusted. That's why we listen to them. They're credible because of their authenticity.
I agree with you. And that's why one of the other avenues we're pursuing, Bob and Merrel and Michael, is that we are now talking to the Victoria Symphony. There's a great interest in Victoria about planting trees, because we're all aware that when it comes to regeneration, one of the most effective ways of trapping carbon is to massively increase the number of trees that we have, both in urban areas and outside urban areas. But in urban areas, as we saw from a fabulous video taken in Halifax, which has got, I think, 50 million trees or some incredible number of trees in its urban area, that it acts as a huge air conditioner, it filters the water, it provides shade, it provides a spiritual awareness. The crime rates in leafy areas of the city are much lower than the crime rates in other parts of this area. And so one of our ideas is to see whether we can get an engagement with the Symphony, where the Symphony would encourage people to plant trees in and around Victoria, both on private and public properties, and use the Symphony players to, in a sense, hug a tree and play their instruments in settings where trees would be relevant and prominent. And they get people to understand the value of trees, and the musicians to be able to be engaged in getting them to seek a pledge to do this. But let me finish also with a comment that I made a couple of days ago on the Great Bear Rainforest, because when I studied in the Great Bear Rainforest, the forest was seen to be unidimensional by the industry, that you cut the trees down for lumber and 2x4s. And that was the only value that people placed on the trees. 20 years later, we have protected almost 85% of all the trees on the coast. We've realized that they've got much more value standing than being cut down, not only for tourism and for environmental values, for fisheries, for water filtration, for controlling windstorms and fires if they're properly managed, but also they trap carbon. And we had a carbon offset protocol, which has allowed the First Nations something like $25 million worth of carbon credits that they can use to build their communities. And some of them are using them to hire guardians, so that the guardians look after the forest, look after the trees, look after the fish, look after their environment, using the carbon credits as a funding mechanism. So it's a fairy tale story of moving from a very industrial society to one where it's based entirely on nature's principles and a wholesome, more rounded nature-based communities evolving. Have you come across any of that, Merrel, in any of your work?
Absolutely. I went for about 6 years. I worked as a chief negotiator with the government of the Northwest Territories when Michael was minister there. And I started off as the chief negotiator for transboundary water agreements in the Mackenzie, but I ended as chief negotiator for what's called Thai-Deni-Nini, which is a national and we negotiated. I represented the government of the Northwest Territories, but there were Indigenous nations leading the charge for this, the creation of this national and territorial park, the size of Belgium, it's massive, probably the last huge national park in Canada, and we, national and territorial. And one of the fundamental things that we did, and this was because this was Michael's way of doing things. It's one of the reasons I agreed to work with the government of the Northwest Territories at the time, was because of their profound, at that time, connection with Indigenous governments as equals, government to government. Let's figure out how to do stuff together. Yes, there are tables where we need to worry about treaties and land claims and all of that kind of stuff, and that's good for there. But in the meantime, we have things we want to accomplish together. And one of them was this park. And what the chief negotiator for the nation, which is Lutselk'e, is Steve Nita, who's very well known now, promoting across Canada this idea of Indigenous conservation and protected areas. And we called it not a park, we called it a conservation economy. Mm. We didn't look at it as it's humans negotiating a park and the humans are separate from the park. It was actually, Lutselk'e, the nation, is in the middle, they live in the middle of the park, or right near on the edge of it, and use all of it. And the whole idea was, it's this idea of the restoration imperative. How do you take what's there and build a future for all of the species that are there collaboratively? The governments that are there, how do you bring your jurisdictions to the table, figure out what needs to happen, and then execute that, implement that? And in that case, Indigenous people absolutely led the charge on that. And we were of the same mind in terms of conservation-based economies. They were going to be using Indigenous guardians. They were going to bring in a whole tourism and multi-use, but still protecting it as a core park, right? It still would meet the worldwide kind of commitments that Canada had made to 12% protected areas, because we jointly negotiated all the pieces. And so that is an example, actually, of a reconciliation approach, because it's a co-design approach. It's where we take something, an old way of doing it, turn it on its head, work together to figure out, what can we do together that meets all of our needs. And so and we actually studied the Great Bear rainforest approach, and Araguay and a whole bunch of places in Canada, the Mealy Mountains, to say, what's the most proactive and we can be to try to achieve kind of the relationship that we need to have between people and species in the context of a protected area.
Right.
John, could I add one quick comment, if I may? I'd like to corroborate one of your observations from your work with the lumber companies that saw the forest in a unidimensional way. When we were doing the work for Thai-Deni-Nini, we had a significant engagement across all sectors, industry, all the communities and regions. And I remember well a meeting we attended with all the mining and Chamber of Mines folks, and their observation and concern about a park 28,000 square kilometers in size was that they saw it as the land being sterilized. and of no further use to anybody, just locked up and just becomes a big chunk of empty land. And that's the value that they saw. And we had a very clear, pointed discussion about that being an inaccurate perception of the land and considering it sterilized when in fact it has such tremendous value in its natural form and shape. But it just corroborates the broad view of industry up till now, for sure, about the land just being there for their use, for resources to be extracted and left.
I agree, and that's why we're very reluctant to use, in British Columbia, use the term park, because park gives that sense of being set aside. But to me, it's interesting in the context of what you said, Merrel, and what I've witnessed on the Central Coast, but also what I'm seeing in this push to restore forested ecosystems in cities, is that there's a real opportunity for us to regenerate nature, both in the urban areas as well as in the countryside. And I would say that to me, that's one of the key initiatives that we should be taking over the next 20 years to flatten the carbon curve. I'm not a big fan of geoengineering and engineered carbon storage. I think that's a mug scheme. What we should be doing is using nature's carbon capacity to store carbon and balance our needs going forward. Yeah.
And so, it's interesting, further to that, SEER, the organization I mentioned that I am part of, has asked itself for a long time, what's the urban indigenous kind of environmental role or question? Because the cities are urban areas, there's not a lot of nature. Indigenous people would have a hard time exercising their treaty rights in the middle of downtown Vancouver or Toronto or Winnipeg. There's nowhere to do that. It's not nature really anymore. But there is this, what we've done is have these projects, because fundamentally reconnecting people to the idea that they are on land, they need to be grounded, they need to see things around them as nature, not just concrete. So we have these projects where we've connected elders with city people and Indigenous people who live in the city, and just walked through the city to see the nature that's there and talk about, I was amazed at how much elders can show you about the nature that is in a city and the medicines that are there and what it can be used for. And that's almost the first step, right? Being connected. Yeah.
Could I speak to that if I could? I think this is a really important point that you've made.
Because
Indigenous values are really, oh, I'm sorry, John, did you want me not to?
No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I think this is a really good point, because Indigenous values are critical. And I think one of the things that's happening through reconciliation is that their values, Indigenous values, are being communicated to other youth. And we talk about transformative moments. Well, there's an intergenerational element about reconciliation that needs to be recognized. And we can't talk about reconciliation either with Indigenous people or anywhere in our culture without talking about youth. And certainly Indigenous youth are powerful motivators of this. But as we've seen, John, with what your program has done, the cultivation of the youth voice has been extraordinarily powerful. And I am much impressed with their courage, their clarity, their intelligence, and also their energy. And I have to say that it is with youth, it is in youth that my greatest hope resides. And it crosses all of these reconciliation areas, and it's a driver of a powerful new transformative possibility.
Well, that seems to me a segue into the second half of our conversation, which is more formally onto the reconciliation work that Merrel and Michael are doing. So maybe I can ask you, Merrel, at the beginning, how did you find reconciliation? What is the essence of reconciliation in the second decade of the 21st century?
Well, there's the more complicated answer, which is about truth telling, recognizing our history, and then making healing, moving an atonement. And that definition comes from Senator Murray Sinclair, who is the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that's mostly how he explains it. And you can see it's because that process that was set up in Canada was about truth-telling, and then about moving forward with a whole series of recommendations, like on how to deal with this, part of the atonement piece. Wilton, Grand Chief Wilton Littlechild, who was a negotiator for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also a key one on the Prime Minister's Reconciliation Council, he said, it's really simple. It's about working together. Like the treaty originally, all of the treaties in Canada, at least as far as the Indigenous people were concerned, were about establishing a relationship between equals of working together. And that's the relationship that's never been implemented. And so reconciliation is about returning to that fundamental piece in everything we do. That's the hard part, right? That's where the hard part and the interesting part, that's the part that all of us can play a role, and it's a shared responsibility. And it's also the challenge, because it's not just something you can say, oh, it's the government's responsibility, or it's Indigenous people's responsibility, or it's residential school survivor responsibility. It's actually all of us. Mm. And so I can talk more about that in a bit, but that, I think, is fundamentally what reconciliation is about.
Michael, is that, have you got much more to add on that?
Not much. I mean, Bob and, well, you all three of you have touched on that. The issue of reconciliation is what I see as a 360-degree concept. People tend to look at it in sometimes a unidimensional way, but it links into not only Indigenous, non-Indigenous, but the land, the economy, all the other things that make up life. And it's about grievous inequities that have been baked into our systems for 153 years since Canada was formed. And they still exist to this day. And we're still talking about it with Indigenous people, because they are still in that position of being in inequity. And our institutions are slow to change. The laws are slow to change. And institutions have long corporate memories, and they're very, very slow. And the Indigenous people have, for 153 years, been pushing forward, and we're still not there. And there's still work to do.
John, could I just make one comment on that? I hope that as we progress here, when you talk about change happening slowly, well, habits have to change too. And I hope that you and Merrel will outline the groundbreaking collaborative leadership initiative that you have been able to undertake in Manitoba at some point here.
Absolutely, we'd love to talk about that.
Well, why don't you go on to it right now?
Okay, we will. I will. So Michael and I are interested in practical examples of reconciliation, and actually not really talking about it so much, but actually doing it and figuring out how to do it. And we also believe that fundamentally the issues that plague Indigenous people and all of Canada are about governance. They're about systems that exclude people from decision making, that they can control their lives. And so, and because I one of the people who co-created SEER with me and the other chiefs was Phil Fontaine, and he has always said to me, this is about controlling our destiny. That's what this is about. The same thing you guys can already do, we can't do, and that's what this is all about. And so you need poverty to be eliminated, you need laws to change, you need a whole bunch of things. But if you think about it in terms of controlling your own destiny, that's decision-making. Decision-making, when done by governments, is governance. And so Michael and I approached this one project in southern Manitoba as a governance issue. And what we said, here's the problem. The problem is Lake Winnipeg is in trouble, big time. It's dying. And no movement, no progress has been made lots of action has happened, but no progress has been made to stop that. And so Michael and I said, you know, if you could, the water flows north through a region of 26 mayors and chiefs. So the territories that are municipal and First Nation. And if we could bring those 26 elected leaders who have decision-making power together in a reconciliation process to get to know each other, and Michael will say, and I'll steal his thunder on this, they haven't been in a room together, many of them, like for 153 years. Never since Canada was created have you had a regional bring together of these political players to get to know each other. And so we did that. That's what we did, because we said, if you can bring them together, even make one decision in common in the same direction on Lake Winnipeg, that's a positive one, you can actually start to have impact. But you got to remember that region in southern Manitoba, the region we used of these 27 leaders and all their municipal and Indigenous territories represents 70% of the population of Manitoba and 68% of the GDP. Mm-hmm. So it's a big, big political mass if they come together. So that's what we did. We started with that premise. And Michael, I don't know if you want to tell the story of how we worked through this, but I'll leave that part for Michael because that's an interesting story too. But I'll say that where this came from in our minds of a process like this was actually based out of South Africa. South Africa at the time, and if you bear with me for a couple minutes because it's a very interesting story, at the time that Nelson Mandela was released from prison, South African society had a decision, in particular, President de Klerk had a decision to make about whether he was going to act like this was just any other day and we're just going to keep society the same. We're going to let Nelson Mandela out, but it's not going to create systemic change. And everybody, many sectors of society recognized that they did need to change. And so a process was undertaken called Transformational Scenario Planning, which was a reconciliation process ultimately of bringing people together to decide on the future they wanted and get there. And it took 4 years in the case of South Africa, but at the end of that 4 years, Nelson Mandela became president. And we modeled that process, but adapted it in Canada to take into account treaties, reconciliation, the United Nations Declaration. We looked at the Canadian context and morphed it to create our own process. And I'll leave the rest of the story on this for Michael to tell on how we actually moved these leaders through this over a 2-year period.
So this, I prefer to think of it as a case of best practices, where I came out of the Northwest Territories, and Merrel had worked there as well, where we had done things like co-drafting laws for the territorial government, the Wildlife Act, Species at Risk Act, with all the Indigenous governments at a table with many hands on the pen. We'd done water strategies like that as well. And we'd figured out ways to do business collectively, because it's a territory that has a consensus system that is 50% Indigenous, so it changes the dynamic, but we showed it could be done. Then we also came across the work done in South Africa, which gave us some ideas in terms of the process. And when we went to the leaders, chiefs, mayors, and reeves, they wanted to know what was going on and what risk they were taking. And we were able to show them that other places in Canada, like the Northwest Territories, like Nova Scotia with Senator Christmas and the work they did in Sydney, what they'd done in South Africa, things were possible. And it's interesting, just on a more human note, reconciliation is writ large in this process, but there's also very small human examples of reconciliation. We set up a table of elders, 2 Indigenous elders and a non-Indigenous elder. And the non-Indigenous elder was a long-time mayor, decades of experience, who acknowledged that he had never in his life actually spoken to an Indigenous person or even been in a room with one other than seeing them in a restaurant or those kind of places, but in his work and in his life, that he'd never done that. And we had a table of elders that over the course of a year and a half became very, very good friends. And the elders took to each other. The non-Indigenous elder said how important this was. He did not realize his whole life how important it was to have this type of arrangement and reconciliation. And it also gave him a much greater appreciation for what an elder meant, because he'd said it now gave him new value and meaning, that he still had worth, which elders in the Indigenous world tend to have much greater value and worth in many cases than non-Indigenous elders that retire and move into old folks' homes and quietly disappear from the scene when all that history is lost. So a little bit of the big picture, a little bit of the small picture. I'll turn it back to Merrel or to yourself.
Well, I'll just end then by just saying we worked them through a 2-year process. It took about 5 meetings. And it started with storytelling, where they had to tell the stories of themselves and their community and their hopes and visions and where they were. And then it moved through a leveling the playing field meeting, where we recognized from talking to them that there were many misperceptions that they had about each other. Lots of knowledge, a lot of awkward assumptions and stereotypes. And so we said, you're not going to talk during this one, you'll just ask questions, and we're going to bring in some of the smartest people in Canada to talk to you about the art of the possible and what you need to know about everything from treaties to taxation to the Indian Act to municipal law to like just about everything you could think about each other's world, the misperceptions. We tried to clarify that in the second meeting. By the third meeting, we started to talk about the art of the possible. Like, what could we do environmentally, economically, to just lift all boats in the region, leave no one behind? Mm-hmm. What could we do? And then the fourth meeting, we basically asked them to asked if they were ready to make a commitment to each other. Because that's what it takes if you want to do governance differently. Mm-hmm. You have to commit to each other. And so they decided to, and we had a ceremony accompanied by the signing of a intergovernmental memorandum of understanding. And we did it at the original signing of Treaty 1, the very first treaty, numbered treaty in Canada at Lower Fort Garry. They gifted each other with actual restrikes of the original Treaty 1 medal and signed. They were in full headdress regalia. And what they did was see this as closing the treaty, closing the relationship, the circle on the relationship that should have been done right from the beginning, but wasn't. So they've now, and that happened about a year ago. And so now they're in the process of moving to action. What do we want to fix? What do we want to do? And they're focusing on a water project, water quality trading, very practical, trying to solve the nutrient problem into Lake Winnipeg. They're focusing on waste management, trying to build a circular economy, zero waste circular economy in the region. They're doing really cool stuff, but they're moving on to collaborative regional action now through this table. And it's called the Collaborative Leadership Initiative. It has its own website, and you can see.
John, one of the key points that made this process work was that the table was for elected leaders only. And there was no officials, no staff except the support staff that helped manage the meetings. Merrel and I were facilitators, and it allowed the elected leaders to get to know each other without any filters, without any handlers, without any briefing notes. And it created that atmosphere and ability to link up with each other that was critical, because you will know as well as I how most normal meetings are when there's politicians, leaders. You have all the people that are handling you and all the documents that are done and the work that's done ahead of time to resolve the issues. So the leaders just have to sign off on many of the things that are already agreed to. This was totally different. This was the leaders exercising their leadership roles as political leaders, which is what I think is missing, or was missing, and what made this a success.
I'd agree.
Hello,
With all due respect to Merrel, there were no lawyers there, so
That too.
Well, there was one.
That too. But she wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't. She didn't have her lawyer's hat on.
The lawyer.
No lawyers, no officials, no bureaucrats, no nothing. Yeah, just the elected leaders.
I wanted to come back, Merrel, because there's a sense, I believe, maybe I'm overstating the situation, but there's a sense, I think, of frustration in Canada that First Nations take a long time to get to decision making. We don't seem to be able to build pipelines and other infrastructure very quickly because the First Nations have to be consulted, and if they don't like it, they go to court. The court cases take years to resolve, and everything gets stalled. And there's a sense that this is the wrong way to do business. But from what I'm hearing, and obviously the Wet'suwet'en situation in the northwest BC is an example of that. But I'd like to get your take on how reconciliation, and more importantly, how the new legal requirements under United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People are playing into this new era of reconciliation and having to avoid the kind of conflict we've had in the past.
That's such a good question and a big question. When you think back to the idea of controlling your own destiny, that means Indigenous governments are part of the decision-making in Canada. They're not who you go consult with and then someone else makes the decision. That's why I'm not a fan of consultation. I've said that, consultation is something that exists, created by the Supreme Court of Canada in order to protect Indigenous rights that might be impacted by a decision that a Crown government makes, federal, provincial, territorial. That's one relationship. The better relationship for the long-term health of Canada and all Indigenous peoples is that we do this together. We make decisions together. That's the essence of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's about consent. And it doesn't have to mean veto. What it means is, as governments, you sit together and you sit there till you figure it out, which is what the federal government and the provincial governments have 153 years of doing, right? It's tough. Sometimes we take each other to court, not very often, but we fight, but we work it out eventually on almost all things. We just don't have Indigenous governments sitting up at that table. But if we did, then you can start to create a common, like a vision that everybody sees themselves in. So you're not fighting at the last end of a pipeline approval process. You're setting the vision for fossil fuel use or oil and gas in Canada together. It's the tail end, big picture where you need to be working, so that, the front end, big picture that you need to be working, not the tail end fighting it out at the last step. And so that's why I see, UNDRIP is about restructuring our institutions of governance, restructuring cooperative federalism as if Indigenous peoples were there as governments. Hold the chair up.
Could I speak to that, John, if I may? Having followed the CLI process from the point of view of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, what became really clear in that process is that resource development issues are going to be painfully stalled in this country for as long as it takes for meaningful reconciliation to happen. And that's why this reconciliation is absolutely vital.
So, John,
sorry, Michael.
So may I jump in as a former politician? And I hope Oliver Brandes is listening to this reply that I want to give. So for 153 years, Indigenous people in Canada have had the foot of the federal government on their neck. And the Canadians non-Indigenous people have to be patient. That Indigenous people did not create the system that they live under. They did not create the law,
Michael, you've just frozen for a minute, so I don't know if you can hear me or not, but you might want to rejig your Zoom so you can come back in. So Bob, did you finish off what you were trying to say?
Yes, I did, but I just want to affirm that because we know how painful this tension over resource development has been, and it's going to likely stay that way until there's true reconciliation. That's my key point.
But how long do you think this is going to take?
Well, so the elders that I've talked to have said, well, it took us 500 years to get into this. It could, and Murray Sinclair says the most common thing he hears is the impatience of non-Indigenous people to like, okay, let's move on already. And it is about a relationship and constantly engaging with each other, not okay, now we're here, we're done, we're good. I think the relationship continually evolves, and I think there's a period of really getting to know each other as we should have done a long time ago. It's going to take time, and we just have to be patient with that, right? And it's for some Indigenous people, it'll be moving too fast. For others, it's too slow. Same with us. But the idea of patience and listening and building relationship is probably the most important thing to remember in terms of this critical moment in history that we are in, because we are in one.
But one of the things that I'm aware of in my work in government is that it takes certain skills and capacities to engage meaningfully with Indigenous cultures. It's not everybody that can do that. And we have, in British Columbia, I'm sure this is true of civil servants across Canada, they're trained as scientists, they're trained as waste managers or wildlife biologists or fisheries biologists, and they're not really trained in listening, in engaging and understanding different cultural perceptions of the landscape. So is your group involved in training people so that they're more sensitive and more greater skills to deal with this new reality?
Well, no, we don't really do cross-cultural training or that kind of thing. But what we do is we are the organization, the board of directors are all Indigenous people, and we work with Indigenous communities, and so we're working on the environmental issues in Indigenous communities with Indigenous communities. Sometimes that involves outsiders, other non-Indigenous folks, and partnerships, between. But so we don't do that. But I can tell you that in the Collaborative Leadership Initiative, we had to spend a lot of time just talking to each other. And as facilitators, we often had to say the thing that we knew was the thought bubble above somebody's head, but they were too afraid to say. And that's why the elders were chosen, because they had the courage to say the things that they knew all the leaders either needed to hear or wanted to ask or what have you. And so, you have to approach these, I just spent most of the beginning of my career as a lawyer and working in an Indigenous organization and having separate clients that were Indigenous, just listening a lot and just spending time in communities. There's no shortcut to a relationship, right?
One thing that was really interesting in observing this process is the incredible value of elders of all societies, true elders, not just people because they're older, but because they've had experience and they're willing to sacrifice immediate benefits for the collective wisdom of the whole collaboration. And that certainly came through. Didn't you think, Merrel, in the Collaborative Leadership Initiative?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean. The story that Michael told about the one non-Indigenous elder, he was a pretty curmudgeonly guy. He had no history of working with Indigenous people, but he was somebody that the non-Indigenous mayors, like the mayors, trusted. He was very well respected in the non-Indigenous community.
Boy, did his views change.
But he had here's an example. So one of the chiefs that created SEER was Chief Manny Jules, who is now the chief commissioner of the First Nations Tax Commission, extremely well-known, well-respected Indigenous leader. And he was one of the original chiefs that hired me to work in Phare as a non-Indigenous lawyer. And he said, the issue is about whether you have commonality of soul.
Mm.
So, and that's what Rodney, the non-Indigenous elder, had. He had an exterior experience, lack of relationship, lack of connection, but he had a commonality of soul with the other elders and was open and listened and was honest and respectful. Even though he said tough things, he said things that needed to be addressed and were hard to deal with. But you have the safe space for the conversation, and you have people like Rodney and Stan McKay, who used to be the first Indigenous moderator of the United Church of Canada. He was one of the elders. Gary McLean. These are wise people who helped lead us through complex and challenging conversations. And they were all just about building relationship, removing misperceptions, change, opening up your soul to the other.
I'm back.
Welcome back, Michael. You're okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Calmed right down.
Yeah, you were on a roll. I can see. I'm like, he's just getting going.
Yeah, I was just calm.
Did you finish what you wanted to say, Michael, or did you want to say a bit more?
Well, I just wanted to point out that people get impatient with Indigenous people. They think they're holding things up. It's not their systems. They were legislated out of the economy. Their land was taken away. The ownership was taken away. All those things have happened, and they've never regained an equal place as one of the founding nations in the country. And as Merrel said, there has to be a seat at Confederation for Indigenous governments. And once we start doing reconciliation and acknowledging that issue, then you'll start to see resolution of some of these what are now intractable problems.
To Bob and Marilyn, and I've had a lot of experience in reconciliation, and I've been involved in a 7-hour diatribe where I was told the whole history of residential schools. And I'm just a poor Scotsman coming over to Canada and not knowing all this history, and I got it in spades. But I have to tell you that there's nothing more enlightening and satisfying when you actually connect between the cultures and you build a trusting relationship. And it's like a good marriage. Even if you have a disagreement, you can always find a way of resolving it. So the concept of veto simply disappears. It's just not relevant. What's relevant is working out a common approach to dealing with a problem. And
Absolutely. It's such a great analogy. And we often use the analogy of marriages or relationships or what have you, right? Like if you think of a partnership you're in, business partnership, marriage, you exercise a veto at great risk to any further relationship, right? And that's the same thing. I don't think consent was meant to be, for some Indigenous governments, it does mean that. There are some, and I'm not saying that's their view and that's fine. And they pursue that. I believe that long-term reconciliation is about the conversation and the commitment to not run roughshod over each other and to work so hard like you do in all negotiations to find the ethical space, the common space of partnership.
So let me try and link together Bob's transformational moment with reconciliation. And I'm now talking about the big picture, because in my mind, within the next 30 years, we have to totally transform our economy, our society, and our spirituality in order to go from a carbon guzzling society with a continuing increasing Keeling curve to one where we're carbon neutral. We flattened the curve and we've now come over on the other side. So that transition involves a huge change to our infrastructure, to the way we educate ourselves, to the way we make business dealings, to the way we run our economy. I mean, it's all elevations. It talks about regenerating nature. It talks about a huge technological change. massive disruption in terms of people working in a fossil fuel industry and having to shift to a low carbon economy. How can we make that change at this stage when we've still not quite got that sense of reconciliation and engagement? Is that not two big items that are too difficult to deal with at the same time? Or are you saying, or I'm saying, maybe this transformation is a unique opportunity to create a binding reconciliation, and it needs something big like this in order to force the pace? Is that where you're coming from?
So I think, to my mind, transformations don't happen like a supernova. There's 153 years of history that have gotten us to this point, and I think of it as we're getting into the narrow end of the funnel where we have no choice. We've been a long time coming, and it's picking up speed. Some of us will say we're past the point of no return, but you just have to keep moving regardless. And all the pieces are there. This latest pandemic has been probably the latest trigger that has brought together a confluence of time and events that maybe now we're ready, because the situation continues to deteriorate and things are getting worse. There's a pause, but the things are not getting better. And this may be the time where it'll come together.
Luann?
Yeah, and I certainly hope so. I think that Indigenous people, they're not a homogenous group any more than any other group is homogenous. You have some Indigenous communities and people that have very strong connections to land and ongoing current and exercise them and do that. And you have others that are not as connected, that have chosen a different path. But I do think that there is many things that we can teach each other. But in particular, because Indigenous people, and I'm coming at this one from a lawyer perspective, and different disciplines would look at it differently, but I look at it with the tool of how can the law help us here? Indigenous folks have very profound rights recognized in law at the constitutional level. Mm-hmm. Unlike any other Canadian, nobody has rights like that. Those rights need a place to be implemented. Their traditional territories need to be healthy. Ecosystems need to be have integrity. They need to be healthy. And so that's where I think that because Indigenous people fight so strongly for protection of their rights, they exercise their rights, they're out on the land, many are. There's a knowledge and awareness of the land and its importance for life. And that's not even the spiritual side, which there's a whole traditional spirituality that is also very much about interconnection and the creator and life and the role of humans with animals and species, etc. And so there's a lot that can be taught about getting fundamentally regrounded to the thing that sustains us. And so a reconciliation between people and learning from each other about those kinds of things, I think, is fundamentally necessary and can help us in the journey to the ultimate reconciliation, which is between people and the world, right? People and the environment, people and ecosystems, yes, the planet.
So can we just quick comment about reconciliation and what I see as internal reconciliation? I was listening to the radio about the Wet'suwet'en people and the observation that one of the clan hereditary chiefs made, that the clans had not met for 10 years, that they were drifted apart, and this crisis brought them together, recognizing that they're stronger together. And it's the same situation that we're working through with, where the government structures and how they set up the First Nations and other Indigenous communities separate and fragmented, and then expect them in 2020 to self-organize because the government doesn't know how to do it. They created the system, they don't know how to fix it. And they'd forgotten their connections to each other, or they had connections that changed to those of suspicion and distrust and uncertainty instead of alliance and partnership and family and allies. And trying to rebuild that internally so that before you can pivot and talk to a provincial government or a territorial or a federal government if you can't even be certain of your own unity and reconciliation within the Indigenous community. And that's a step that has been missing, and people are getting impatient, and they want to try to undo 153 years of history in a matter of a month or a few years, giving no recognition to that type of history.
Could I speak to that matter too, John?
Absolutely, because you've been silent for a few minutes, Bob, and you always make me very nervous when you're silent.
Well, I think that this is such an important point in the conversation. And, I understand the frustration that Michael has just described, and a lot of people are feeling it in a lot of different ways. And, you opened up by saying that, we need to do this in the next 30 years. Well, we at the UN are saying that we've got to do it by 2030. If it takes full 30 years to do that, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And what we think we have to do here is stop focusing on the cost of action and start talking about the cost of inaction on all of these matters. And you've heard me say this before. I think what we urgently need now is a second and very different enlightenment. But no enlightenment can begin without a renaissance. And as you've reminded us, John, humanity's first renaissance was born in Italy following an epidemic of the Black Plague in the 14th century. Maybe this is an opportunity now. Maybe this is a moment. And maybe this is when this renaissance could begin. And that renaissance could begin with reconciliation with one another, which in Canada, which in this country means reconciliation with First Nations, and then reconciliation with the planet as a whole. But we got to move this along. I mean, if we miss this opportunity and drag our feet, we may miss the opportunity for the transformation we need.
So I want to come back to my opening comments, because I think we're beginning to come to a conclusion. But in my opening comment, I said that the four fundamental things that are driving me and my wife's path is the need to reconnect with nature, the need to make sure that how we live within nature's limits. Right now, we're living well outside nature's limits. So let's not kid ourselves that to get back into living within nature's limits needs a transformative approach to the way we're managing our economy and managing ourselves. And it seems to me that the Indigenous folks in Canada are those who can teach us most about that and help us on that particular journey. The second thing that has struck me is in your collaborative relationship is the fact that people are willing to subjugate their personal and self-interest to that of the community, so that people are, I think that's what I heard, Merrel, from your example in south of Winnipeg, that all of these reefs and the Indigenous people realized that they were better off working collaboratively and together than trying to protect their own self-interest, which is normally the way politicians try to do. And
Absolutely.
a wonderful learning experience.
Yeah, in fact, how it started was a number of the chiefs and the mayors and the reeves went for breakfast and without an agenda, and they decided one thing, and this is where it started. I was at that meeting. I did a little presentation on process, but what they decided was the status quo is not good enough. That was the fundamental thing that had to happen, is they had to say, it's not good enough now. We need to do something different. And we will take the risk to engage in a process together. We'll see where it goes. And we continually said, you can step out anytime. It's your process. Mm-hmm. But they agreed, we need to change. It's just not good enough anymore. And so we have to find a different way. And yeah, so that's what really began that kind of transformation, that shift for them. And it's an ongoing struggle, though, just like any relationship. They're used to thinking about their own community. They're not used to thinking like a region. They're not used to thinking across reserve borders and treaty land borders and municipal borders. They're not used to thinking that way. And they deal with different levels of government. And so it's a constant relearning and a constant rebuilding of governance structures, like at every level. But that's what I believe, and Michael and I and Bob and others who are involved in it believe is the only way to reconciliation. You've just got to rebuild it, rebuild everything.
But one of the fascinating aspects of that, Merrel, is that once people have crossed that threshold from being self-interested to community, they never actually go back.
Yeah.
It becomes a new way of thinking and being. They actually fundamentally change the way they interact.
I think what's happening here is the realization that we really need to build what Maryland is, and Michael are talking about, what you're talking about too, John. We need to create a post-colonial Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure about the term, but I come from a colony. No, the Great Britain created the colonies, but I agree with what you're saying in principle.
Some people call it a decolonization process.
Yeah,
you know, you because we're all part of a system that we didn't create, that locks us into a certain way that decisions are made and stuff happens. None of us created this, but we all have the opportunity to say, within my little slice of the world, within my job, within my time here, what can I do to change that system, to restore justice?
But the big point you made, Merrel, is that at this famous breakfast, people realized that the status quo no longer operated.
Absolutely.
You get a universal understanding post-pandemic that what was the status quo the pre-pandemic simply isn't good enough. That there's a universal understanding that we can do better.
Yep.
That starts us on this road over the next 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
But the third lesson I'm learning from you and Michael is the spirituality, the ingrained sense that the Indigenous people have between themselves and the larger universe, and the fact that they're constantly in touch with how they are in not only their traditional territory, but where they are on the earth and where they are in the universe. And it's that sense of belonging that I think we all have to reconnect to as we move through this transition. Is that your comment?
Yeah, I think in now Indigenous spirituality is complex and multifaceted, right? You have many Indigenous communities that are Christian. They're not traditional anymore. They don't have those value systems. Some of them are still. And so there's no one way. But I do think that, and some are both. They join them together because that's actually what their reality is now. But I do see that in the traditional stories, in the traditional knowledge, there are very profound rules for living, rules for good life, mm-hmm. for being here in a good way. And so many of the prayers and the stories are focused on that. Everything from harvesting animals to law to how to resolve conflict. There's just so many. Traditional knowledge isn't just about where the moose are or the fish. It's about how families' responsibilities and how decisions are made and how conflict is resolved and all that. I mean, and there is so much. Right now, I'm a commissioner in the International Joint Commission, and we have an Indigenous commissioner for the first time in Canada's history on the commission. One of the 6 of us is Henry Lickers, who's from Akwesasne. And the amount of times that he brings in Haudenosaunee, because that's what he's a group of, he's Seneca, but he's part of the Haudenosaunee, teachings to the commissioners about how to operate in a consensus decision-making process, for example. Or there's just so many things that we're learning, and it's such a good example of I think how traditions, and he's a scientist. Mm-hmm. His job is he's a scientist. So he's combining these things together and using it to protect transboundary waters, So I believe that connection to those teachings, regardless of their base, is critical.
But my feeling from my personal experience is that if you have these natural inbuilt capabilities, when you get a crisis like we're facing now, let's face it, we do have a climate crisis. We're in a major climate crisis, and if we don't do anything substantial, we are in danger of maintaining our civilization. So we've got a lot to do in the next, Bob says 10 years. I still think it's going to take 30 years to make the full transition. But the very crisis is a way that people come to the conclusion that you're saying, Merrel, and status quo no longer works, and that there is a change that we can do, both individually and collectively, that will lead us to a much better life. And we, in fact, need the crisis to be the stimulus to change course. And that's what I'm holding on to right now. But has anyone else got any more to say? Because I just want to know whether we can start to wrap up this lovely conversation we've had in the last hour or so.
One quick comment, John, if I may, now that I'm back yet again.
Yes, sir.
Just wanted to corroborate your observation that out of almost every crisis I've been involved in comes opportunity. There's always a silver cloud, especially if you're forced to look for it because you have no other way to get out of the crisis.
Absolutely. And if you don't take advantage of it, you're the loser. When you take advantage of it, you're the winner. And we all want to be winners.
Yes.
So, Bob, are you any last words?
Well, I was just thinking about what you said and what Michael said, and I'm just reminded of what Winston Churchill said. When you're in hell, whatever you do, don't stop. I think there's opportunity here, and there is transformation ahead for us if we attend to it and work together.
Merrel, any final comments?
Just that I think in terms of my understanding of reconciliation, and when I look at the people we've interviewed on our podcast, because what we're trying to do is interview people who are doing it from all kind of walks of life. It's the sports and reconciliation, hip hop and reconciliation, like all different folks. And I think what I've come to understand is reconciliation is a full range from the very intensely personal, like for the hip hop Dylan Jones that we interviewed, it's about suicides and 12-year-old kids in communities never having another 12-year-old Indigenous boy die by his own hand in a community, to other very big, lofty government process, like the kind I talk about. It's all of that. And that's when Michael says it's 360, it's from very personal things to very big systems change, not just one or the other. So I think I would just like to leave with that idea.
That's wonderful.
Reconciliation is the fuel that'll get us through the transformation.
I agree. So we will be exploring this further in our fall series. So thank you very much, you folks. That was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Wonderful contributions, very thoughtful, very profound, and very moving in many cases. And I think that we have a video that we can continue to share from time to time with our friends, and hopefully they'll get the same level of inspiration.